Before we jump into tonight's story, I want to take a quick second to say thank you. We've had so many new listeners joining lately, and it honestly means so much to me that you're here, that you're choosing to spend your time in the map room with me. And also, we've officially pinned 25 states to the map. We're halfway through, which is kind of wild to think about. There are still so many stories left to tell, so many dark corners we haven't stepped into yet, and I'm really excited for what's ahead. So, whether you've been here since the beginning or you're just finding the show, I'm really glad you're here. All right, let's get into tonight's story. Imagine you're walking along a quiet ridge in southern Ohio. The air is still, the trees are thick around you, filtering the sunlight into soft patches across the ground. Beneath your feet, the earth rises gently, almost like a natural path pulling you forward. You can hear birds somewhere in the distance, maybe the faint sound of water moving through the valley below. It feels peaceful and ordinary, just another stretch of forest. But then someone tells you to keep going, just a little farther. And eventually you step into a clearing, and you see an observation tower rising above the trees. You climb the steps, one by one, and when you reach the top, you look down. And suddenly, nothing about this place feels ordinary anymore, because stretched across the ridge beneath you is a serpent, a massive one, not carved in stone or painted into the ground, but formed from the earth itself. Its body winds back and forth in long, deliberate curves, almost rhythmic in the way it moves across the landscape. Its tail coils tightly at one end, and at the other, its head stretches forward, slightly raised, its mouth open. And inside that open mouth is an oval shape, something it appears to be swallowing or holding. The entire figure stretches more than 1,300 feet long, longer than 4 football fields. And here's the part that makes it even stranger. No one today can say for certain who built it. No one can tell you exactly when it was built or what it was meant to represent. And yet, someone stood here once and knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what it meant, they knew why it mattered, and whatever that reason was, it was important enough to shape the earth itself. In every state, there's a story they don't tell you, a mystery left unsolved, a secret buried beneath the surface, a moment in time when something went terribly wrong. Welcome to History's Dark Corners, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on America's most unsettling stories, one state at a time. I'm Melissa Hamblin, and tonight we're pinning Ohio to the map. Welcome to the map room. Pull up a chair, keep your lantern close, because tonight we're heading to a quiet ridge in southern Ohio. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. Rolling hills, thick trees, a stretch of land that feels peaceful, almost forgettable. The kind of place you could drive right past without ever realizing what's there. But hidden among those trees is something that shouldn't exist. Not in the way it does. Because built up from the earth itself, stretching across a narrow ridge high above the valley, is a serpent. More than 1,300 feet long, its body winds through the landscape in smooth, deliberate curves. Its tail is tightly coiled behind it, and its head stretches forward, mouth open, toward an oval shape that no one has ever fully explained. For more than a century, people have stood above it, trying to understand what they're looking at. Who built it? When was it built? And why? Some believe it marks the movement of the sun and moon. Others believe it tells a story that's been lost to time. And some have looked at its size, its precision, its placement, and wondered if it points to something far beyond what we can easily explain. Because the truth is, this isn't just a mound of earth. It's a message. One that was clearly understood by the people who built it, and somehow never fully passed down to us. Tonight, we're stepping onto that ridge. We're standing above the serpent, and we're asking the question that still hasn't been fully answered. This is the dark history of Ohio. This is the mystery of the Serpent Mound. So now that we're here, standing on that ridge in southern Ohio, let's slow down for a second and actually look at what this place is. Today it's known as Serpent Mound, but the first thing to understand is this. It's not carved into the ground. It's built up from it. It's what's called an earthwork, which means the people who created it shaped the land itself, moving soil layer by layer to form something intentional. And when you're standing on it, it doesn't feel massive. It rises only a few feet, about 3 at most, and stretches maybe 20 feet across. It's covered in grass, and it looks like a natural rise in the earth, something you might not even question. But that's where it starts to feel a little strange, because this small rise is part of something much larger, something that stretches more than 1,300 feet across the ridge. And from ground level, you can't really see it. You have to step back, or better yet, get above it. And once you do, that's when everything clicks into place. That long, winding shape, the body moving in smooth, deliberate curves, that tail coiled at one end, and the head stretching out at the other. When you see it all at once, it's unmistakably a serpent. And that's where the real mystery begins, because this isn't just a shape, it's a structure, something that was planned, measured, and built with purpose. And yet today we still don't know who built it, and we don't know exactly when it was built or what it was meant to represent. There are theories, of course, there are educated guesses, but no clear answers. And the more you look at it, the more deliberate it feels. Not random or accidental, but purposeful in a way we don't fully understand anymore. And that's part of what makes this place so fascinating, because you're not just looking at something old, you're looking at something that carried a very specific meaning to the people who built it. Now, to really understand how something like this could exist, you have to zoom out a little bit, because this place isn't a one-off. Serpent Mound didn't just appear out of nowhere. Long before European settlers arrived, the Ohio River Valley was home to cultures that were shaping the land in really intentional and massive ways. And when I say massive, I don't just mean big piles of dirt. I mean entire landscapes designed on purpose. People were moving earth by hand without modern tools and creating huge geometric shapes across the land. Circles, squares, octagons, some of them stretching for hundreds of feet, others for miles. And these weren't rough or accidental. Some of the circles are so precise that even today, engineers look at them and go, how did they do that? Some of the shapes line up with the sun and the moon, marking things like solstices or lunar cycles, which tells us they weren't just building randomly, they were watching the sky, tracking patterns, and planning ahead. At a place called Newark Earthworks, located in central Ohio, not too far from Columbus, the shapes are so large and so carefully designed that you can't really understand what you're looking at unless you see them from above. Then there's Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. At one point, it was one of the largest cities in North America. Tens of thousands of people were living there. There were massive mounds, some of them towering over the landscape, along with organized streets, gathering spaces, and a clear sense of structure in how this city was laid out. It wasn't a simple world. This was a world of planning, of engineering, and of meaning. And once you start to see that, it changes the way you look at something like the Serpent Mound. Because instead of asking, how could anyone have built this, the better question becomes, what did it mean to the people who did? Now, there's something about this location that makes it even more interesting. And it's something the people who built this may not have fully understood scientifically, but they may have felt it. Because long before the serpent was ever built, something violent happened here. Millions of years ago, a meteorite, or possibly a comet, slammed into this region with incredible force. The impact didn't just leave a crater, it shattered the bedrock beneath the surface and pushed the land upward, twisting and lifting the landscape in ways that are still unusual today. The result was a disturbed area nearly 8 miles wide, and it didn't stay as a clean, obvious crater the way you might picture. Over time, the edges softened, the land eroded, trees grew, and water carved its way through the hills. But underneath all of that, the damage remained. Even today, the ground beneath what we now call the Serpent Mound is fractured, uneven, and structurally unlike the land around it. And you might not consciously notice it, but it's there. So if you try to picture this place thousands of years ago, before roads, before buildings, before anything modern, this ridge would have stood out, not just visually, but physically. It would have felt different under your feet. And while the people who built the mound wouldn't have known anything about meteor impacts, they would have known this was not just an ordinary place, because places like this tend to stand out. And over time, places like that often become important, not just practically, but culturally and even spiritually. They become places people return to, places where things happen, places that get marked. And those are the kinds of places people choose when they're building something meant to last. For centuries, the serpent just remained, quiet and unexplained, and largely unnoticed outside of the people who lived nearby. And then in the 1800s, that started to change. Two researchers, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, began documenting the ancient earthworks scattered across the Ohio Valley. They were some of the first people to really study these sites in a serious, organized way. And when they came across the Serpent Mound, they realized pretty quickly that this was something different, something extraordinary. They mapped it, they recorded it, and they brought attention to it. But by the time that happened, the mound was already in danger. Parts of it had been damaged. Sections had been plowed over. Other areas were slowly wearing away from erosion. There was no protection in place. And at the time, it still wasn't widely recognized for what it truly was, which means it could easily have disappeared completely. And in a lot of ways, that would have been the end of the story. But in the 1880s, a Harvard archaeologist named Frederick Ward Putnam stepped in. He saw the importance of the site, and more importantly, he understood what would be lost if nothing was done. So efforts were made to preserve it. Land was purchased, the mound was protected, and later in the 1930s, additional work helped stabilize the structure and restore parts of the serpent that had already been damaged. And that leads me to something important to keep in mind. What we see today is ancient, but it hasn't been left completely untouched. It's been cared for and preserved, and in some places carefully reshaped, which means even when we're standing there looking at something that feels incredibly old, we're still seeing it through a modern lens. And in a way, even our view of the past has been shaped over time. And this is where the mystery really starts to deepen, because even with everything we've learned, we still don't know exactly who built it. For a long time, archaeologists believed the serpent was created by a group known as the Adena culture. The Adena lived in this region more than 2,000 years ago, and they're best known for building burial mounds, large, carefully constructed earthworks that were often used for ceremonial or spiritual purposes. And that connection makes sense, because there are Adena burial mounds located near Serpent Mound. So the thinking was this must be part of the same tradition. But when researchers started looking more closely at the serpent itself, things didn't quite line up. Unlike many Adena sites, this mound didn't contain the kinds of artifacts that you would expect. There were no tools, no pottery, and no clear burial remains tied to the structure. Nothing that definitively said this is who built it. And that's unusual, because in archaeology, those kinds of details are often what help tell the story. So for a while, the identity of the builders remained uncertain. And then in the 1990s, new testing seemed to offer an answer. Charcoal samples taken from within the mound were radiocarbon dated, and the results pointed to around 1,000 years ago, which suggested a completely different group, a culture known as the Fort Ancient people. Now, the Fort Ancient culture lived in this region much later than the Adena. They were agricultural. They farmed crops like corn, beans, and squash. They lived in small villages, often near rivers, and their daily life would have been structured around both survival and community. But like the Adena before them, they also built earthworks, not necessarily for burial in the same way, but for gathering, ceremony, and meaning. And if the Serpent Mound really was built by the Fort Ancient people, it would suggest that this wasn't just a random construction, it was intentional and symbolic, possibly tied to something they believed about the world around them. After this discovery, for a moment, it felt like the mystery might actually be solved. There was a clear answer and a defined timeline. But archaeology doesn't always work that way, because the more researchers studied the site, the more complicated it became. Some of the charcoal used for dating may not have come from the original construction. Parts of the mound had been disturbed over time. They'd been repaired and reshaped, even slightly altered during preservation efforts. So now, instead of one clear answer, we're just left with possibilities. Maybe it was built by the Adena. Maybe it was built by the Fort Ancient people. Or maybe it wasn't just one group at all. Maybe this was a place that mattered for generations, a place that people returned to, added to, reinterpreted, and used in different ways over time. And that idea starts to change the question, because instead of asking who built this, we start asking something bigger. Who kept coming back here and why? What kind of place continues to matter for centuries? And what did it represent to the people who stood there when it was new? So if this wasn't a burial site, and it may have been used across generations, then what was it for? To even start answering that, we have to look at the shape itself, because the serpent isn't just decoration, it's a symbol. And across many indigenous cultures in North America, serpents appear again and again, not just as animals, but as powerful, meaningful figures. They're often connected to water, to the earth itself, and to forces that exist just beneath the surface of what we can see. In some traditions, serpents are tied to creation. In others, they represent transformation, the idea that something can change form or move between worlds. Sometimes they're associated with the underworld, or with cycles, life, death, and renewal. And while those meanings vary between cultures, there's a common thread running through them. The serpent isn't random. It carries meaning. So when you look at something like this, it's most certainly not just a shape on the ground. It's communicating something. And then there's the detail at the head. Because when you look closely, the serpent isn't alone. Right in front of its mouth is an oval shape. And the way it's positioned is hard to ignore. It looks like the serpent is opening its mouth toward it, like it's about to swallow it, or already is. And that single detail changes everything, because now you're not just looking at a serpent, you're looking at an interaction, a moment that something is happening. And depending on how you interpret that moment, the meaning shifts. If that oval is an egg, it could represent creation, the beginning of life, something new emerging into the world. If the serpent is consuming it, it could represent destruction or transformation, or the idea that life continues in cycles, that endings aren't really endings, they become something else. Some people have suggested it could represent the sun, or a celestial event, or something tied to the sky. Others think it may not be an object at all, but part of a story we don't fully understand anymore. And whatever it meant, it belonged to the people who built it. For them, the meaning would have been obvious in a way that it no longer is for us. And there's another layer to this story, one that's a little harder to see. Because when we ask what the Serpent Mound means, we're asking from the outside looking in. We're looking at something that wasn't created for us and trying to interpret it without the context it once had. The people who built it didn't leave behind written explanations that we can easily read today, but that doesn't mean there weren't stories. In fact, there certainly were, because across many indigenous cultures in North America, serpents appear again and again, like I mentioned, not just as animals, but as powerful beings. In some traditions, there are stories of a great serpent, sometimes described as a horned serpent, connected to water, to the earth, and to forces that exist just beyond what we see. These aren't simple creatures. They're not always good or evil, but they're powerful and they're transformational, part of the balance of the world. And while we can't say for certain that Serpent Mound represents one specific story, it's very possible that it was connected to beliefs like these, to stories that were passed down, shared among people who gathered in that place. And over time, those stories became harder for us to access, not necessarily because they disappeared, but because they were never meant to be written down in a way outsiders could easily interpret. And that's something important to sit with, because when we look at Serpent Mound today, we're not looking at something meaningless, we're looking at something that still holds meaning, just not in a way we can fully understand anymore. There is another layer to this mystery, one that doesn't just look at the ground, but looks up. because some researchers believe this wasn't just built to be seen, it was built to line up with the sky. Now, if you think about that, it might sound a little abstract at first, but for people living thousands of years ago, the sky wasn't just something you glanced at. It was how you understood time. The movement of the sun told you when to plant, when to harvest, when the seasons were changing. And if you paid close enough attention, those patterns became predictable, reliable, something you could build around. So the idea is this. What if the Serpent Mound was designed with those patterns in mind? When researchers study the layout, one of the things they've noticed is the position of the head. It appears to point toward the place on the horizon where the sun sets on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. And that's significant, because the solstice isn't subtle. If you're watching the horizon day after day, you would notice the sun slowly shifting its position until it reaches its farthest point. And then it turns, and it starts moving back the other way. That moment when it pauses and changes direction would have mattered. It's a marker, a turning point, and some researchers believed the serpent's head may have been aligned to that exact moment, not randomly, but intentionally. And it doesn't stop there. Other parts of the serpent's body, the curves, the bends, have been suggested to line up with additional solar and even lunar events throughout the year, different points on the horizon, different positions of the sun or moon at specific times. So if that's true, this wasn't just a symbol, it may also have functioned as a kind of calendar, not in the way we think of calendars today, but as a place where people could gather, observe, and mark time together, a place where the movements of the sky and the shape of the earth were connected, where what was happening above was reflected below. But this is where things get complicated, because not everyone agrees with these interpretations. Some of these alignments are difficult to prove with certainty. Others may line up loosely, but not precisely enough to confirm intention. And when you're working with something this old, something that's been repaired, reshaped, and weathered over time, it becomes even harder to know what was original. So, like so much of the Serpent Mound, this idea sits in that space between possibility and certainty. It might be intentional, it might be meaningful, or it might be something we're trying to make sense of from a distance we can't quite close. And then there's one more idea. This one feels a little different, less like something you dig up from the ground and more like something written across the sky. Because in the year 1054, something appeared above the earth that shouldn't have been there. A new star, bright and unmistakable. It didn't slowly fade into view like most stars do, it just appeared, and not faintly. This was something people could see in broad daylight for weeks. Imagine stepping outside in the middle of the day, looking up and seeing a bright point of light hanging in the sky where nothing had been before, something bright enough to compete with the sun. And then when night falls, it's still there, unmoving, day after day, night after night. Ancient observers across the world recorded it, especially in China, where detailed records describe a guest star that remained visible for nearly 2 years before finally fading away. Today we know what it was, a supernova, a distant star exploding, sending light across space that eventually reached Earth. But at the time, there was no scientific explanation, only the experience. And for people living in that world, this wouldn't have felt like a random event. It would have felt like a sign, something significant, something worth remembering. And that's where the theory comes in. Some researchers have suggested that the Serpent Mound could be connected to this moment in time, that the shape of the serpent and that oval form at its head might represent something seen in the sky, a bright object, a celestial event, something appearing and being consumed or transformed, a moment translated from the sky into the earth. And if the mound really was built by the fort ancient culture, the timing does line up. But again, this is where we have to be careful, because there's no definitive proof linking the two, no record that says this was their intention, and no way to know exactly what they saw or how they understood it. So, like so much of this story, it remains a possibility, another layer and another way to read the serpent. And of course, when something like this exists, something this large, this precise, and this difficult to fully explain, people start looking for answers. And not all of those answers stay within archaeology. Some of them go a little further. There are theories that the Serpent Mound was built by a lost advanced civilization, a group with knowledge that, at least from our perspective, doesn't seem like it should have existed at the time. People point to the scale, the precision, the way it may line up with the sky, and they ask, how? How do you plan something like this without modern tools? How do you measure something this large? How do you design it so it only fully reveals itself from above? And once you start asking those questions, it's not a huge leap to go even further. Because yes, there are also theories that something not from this world may have been involved. That what we're looking at isn't just human creativity, but it's something guided, something influenced, something beyond us. And if you've ever seen the Serpent Mound from above, you can understand why people go there. Because it doesn't feel small, it doesn't feel accidental, it feels very deliberate in a way that's hard to ignore. Like every curve was placed on purpose, like it was meant to be seen as a whole. And when something feels that deliberate, it naturally makes people ask bigger questions. So when you are looking into the Serpent Mound, you will hear people throw around the word alien a lot. But here's where we have to pause for a second. Because while those ideas are interesting, they're not the only explanation. The cultures that lived in this region were already capable of building extraordinary things. We've seen it. At Newark, at Cahokia, across the Ohio River Valley. They understood the land. They understood patterns in the sky. They understood how to organize labor, how to plan, how to build with intention. And when we look at those cultures on their own terms, what they accomplished is already remarkable. It doesn't need to be explained away. So maybe the real mystery isn't how this was built. Maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe it's that we're looking at something that was once completely understood and realizing we no longer have the full context to read it. Today, the Serpent Mound is still there, quietly stretched across that ridge in southern Ohio. It's not surrounded by a city. It's not part of a crowded tourist destination. It's tucked into a rural part of the state, surrounded by trees and open land. To get there, you drive along winding roads, past farmland, past small towns, through the kind of place where everything just feels a little slower and a little quieter. When you arrive, it's pretty simple. There's a small visitor center, a walking path, and the mound itself. You can't walk directly onto the serpent anymore. It's protected now. But there's a trail that loops around it, letting you follow its shape from the ground. And from that perspective, it's easy to miss. It's subtle, low to the ground, and almost hidden in plain sight. And then there's the observation tower. And that's where everything changes, because once you climb up and look down, you finally see it. The full shape, the true scale. All of those curves connecting into something unmistakable. And in that moment, it stops feeling like just a mound of earth. It feels like something intentional that was meant to be seen from above, like the people who built it understood exactly how it would look from a perspective they couldn't even stand in. I haven't been there yet, but this is one of those places I really want to see someday, because I can imagine standing there, looking down at that serpent, and realizing you're seeing something people built hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, and still not fully understanding why. I imagine what it would feel like at sunrise, when the light hits the curves of the mound and stretches shadows across the grass, or at sunset, when everything softens and the serpent seems to sink back into the earth again, almost like it was never meant to stand out, only to be noticed by the people who knew where to look. There's a strange feeling that comes with places like this, and it's hard to fully explain until you experience it for yourself, because you're standing in the present, but everything around you is connected to the past. The trees are newer, the path is maintained, there's a visitor center, signs, a clear sense of the modern world around you. But the shape in the ground, that's something else entirely. That's old, much older than anything surrounding it. And for a moment, it feels like you're standing between two worlds, the one you understand and the one you don't. And maybe that's why places like this stay with people, because they remind us that history isn't always something we can fully explain. Sometimes it's something you feel. You're not just looking at the past, you're standing inside a story that isn't fully yours. And that's what makes it powerful. Because Serpent Mound isn't just something that survived, it's something that once made perfect sense to someone, and now we're the ones trying to understand it. So if you ever find yourself standing on that ridge in southern Ohio, looking down at the serpent stretched across the earth, take a moment. Try to imagine the people who stood there before you. Picture them shaping the ground, curve by curve, building something they believed would last, something they understood completely. They knew why it was there, and they knew the story it was telling. And now, we're the ones left trying to read it. But the serpent doesn't explain itself. It never has. It just waits, quietly, holding on to a story that once made perfect sense, even if it doesn't anymore. If you enjoyed tonight's journey onto that quiet ridge in southern Ohio, make sure you're following the show so you don't miss what we uncover next. New episodes drop every Tuesday, and we're making our way across the country, one shadowed story at a time. If you haven't left a review yet, I would truly appreciate it. Your reviews help new listeners find the map room, and they help keep this little lantern glowing. And if there's a story you think belongs here, something from your hometown maybe, a mystery you've never been able to shake, or a piece of history that still feels unfinished, send it my way. You can email me at historiesdarkcornerspodcast@gmail.com. I really do read every message. You can also follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, episode updates, and a few extra clues as we go. And truly, thank you. Thank you for listening, thank you for being here, and thank you for stepping into the dark with me. Until next time, keep your lantern lit, keep your curiosity sharp, and remember, every state has a dark corner. I'll meet you there.